96, 97, if people think it's big today, like 96, 97, TNN, ESPN, Tony Stewart, Jeff Gordon. I mean, racing was, I would say, sprint car racing, as far as societally based, was at least 3 to 4 times bigger than it is right now, as far as like regular people.
Like, like I was a big Wolfgang fan, like growing up and all that stuff.
Well, and TNN was a big, it was a big network back then. It wasn't some little bullshit.
It was exciting as hell to watch it on TV and all that stuff. And I mean, it's totally exciting being at the race. We always said, like, with TNN guys, they could come and record. You knew who won the Nationals. You knew where everyone finished. But the way they talked, the way they followed and covered and all that stuff is like they made it more exciting to watch it on TV, And it just, I was a fan of those guys. I mean, hell, we watched Swamp Buggies and all that stuff. I mean, anything that Ed Bruce, Brock Yates, Steve Evans. I mean, anything they announced was exciting. I mean, they could probably go watch a damn turtle race and make it exciting.
Well, and see, I have my opinions on racing. Even Larson stuff and notoriety and respect. I have it based on media. All my opinions are based on media. So when I wanted to know what, made dirt racing bigger or dirt racing smaller, I studied personally about 8 years ago, or seven really, I got deep into it. What did media do with motorsport? In motorsports media, and what I mean, I studied it. So like 96, 97, 98, 99, you had a real big transitional period in motorsports. Pre that era, you could turn on ESPN or TNN or a regular station, and you could catch a sprint car race. You could catch an IndyCar race, a NASCAR race. They had ESPN Speed World, which was basically showcasing every form of motorsport. And really, the era you're talking about was kind of this NASCAR, and I hate to say it, NASCAR dominant era. Prior to this era, 96, 97 is when the IndyCar split happened. IndyCars used to be the number one. This NASCAR shit. Go ahead.
I mean, that's basically all I want stuff. I just wanted to watch the Indy tradition, all that stuff. And
right.
Then, the dirt cars back in the day, if you were good in the dirt car, you race a sprint car, you race the champ car, you work your way into the Indy side. You got to ride at Indy, and
right.
I mean, we were friends with Roger Rager, all those guys who would tell us stories about that stuff and what you had to do and the innovation and all that stuff. So I mean, there was a lot of tradition, and then it just kind of Indy kind of took a different turn, when they did that deal. But then the IRL came back. And it was kind of was like the old school type thing, everyone was equal, but yet, it was still Indy, I mean, they split.
Well, and I always joke, the split you're talking about, kart, and that's how big American kart racing, the brand kart, was huge. Nigel, man, and people like to float about F1 today. I try to talk to people about how big kart actually was back then, but before the IRL split. And I think it was 1992 or 93, Nigel Mansell, the Formula One champion, left Formula One and came to kart because America was kind of like this entertainment capital of the world. Everybody watched what we did. This was kind of the Days of Thunder era. This was the the eras of just breeding television and movie stars. This was the Tom Cruise coming up era, Top Gun and Days of Thunder. All these things were so influential worldwide. And you had people coming here. They didn't give the F1 champion left Formula One to come race kart. And I think honestly at that point, the world powers said, fuck you, this ain't happening no more. And I think that F1, and there's people who agree with this. Jacques Villeneuve, I pulled up an article before. Jacques Villeneuve believes that F1 colluded with NASCAR and Indianapolis Motor Speedway to create the IRL, to split up the IndyCar scene, to also rise the NASCAR scene, because international fans would not be fans of stock car racing because it didn't look anything like a F1 car. A kart vehicle looked very similar, so they could crossbreed a fan base in that element and their drivers. You know, a Nigel Mansell could come to America and and he contended, he won the championship in an IndyCar and take the fans from F1 and bring them to America. And Jacques Villeneuve and a bunch of people believe that F1 was very constructive in splitting up the IndyCar scene as well as rising the NASCAR scene, because if NASCAR became the dominant motorsports of America, the international fans were protected because they could never associate or relate to NASCAR motorsport racing because it's a stock car, you know.
Well, look at your first big start. I mean, like the Stewarts, Gordon. I mean, like they were the first ones to get kind of snagged sprint cars and the midgets and the.
That was
racing,
because of the
dirt
split,
cars.
yes.
They kind
Can
of
you get
snagged
me
into
one more?
that. So I mean, that just kind of opens up the whole pool, of like went on and all that stuff. You used to have your stock car, you used to have your race car, your sprint cars, your drag cars, all that stuff. Everyone was kind of separate and all that stuff. And then those guys did it, and it's kind of like, I mean, it's like Larson. I mean, hell, anything you can drive it,
Right.
And
Well,
it's just.
Well, I mean, the only issue, it's like Coach Trickle said in Days of Thunder. He wanted to go to Indy, but he wasn't an Unser or bringing a big sponsor or an Andretti. So he had to go to NASCAR to make a name for himself, and that was very similar to Jeff Gordon.
With Tim Richmond, basically, is what that story was.
Well, but Tim Richmond did run Indy cars. He did drive sprint cars. I think the Coach Trickle story aligns with Jeff Gordon way more than Tim Richmond. That's why I say it's Illuminati and future telling. And also, you did have a movie come to life. I mean, did we not? I mean, you did have a Man in Black, a 7-time Cup champion, races some cocky rich kid out of California running sprint cars, and an outlaw champion in the movie, Coach Trickle and Rowdy Burns. And then you had 4 years later, get that, 4 years later, you had a California sprint car driver come up and start racing Dale Sr., who was a multi-time, and that was the show in the 90s, the late 90s, they had to destroy IndyCar racing, but when IndyCar racing got split up, that movie that came to life was very intriguing to people.
They really did the rivalry up, like they hated each other, and it was the young guy, the old gun, And then I remember talking to Bob Trossel one night, and Bob Trossel laughed. He said, "Oh hell," he said, "those guys are friends. It's basically an act, I mean, they were competitive and all that stuff. I mean, hell, they were friends,
Right, just like
those guys. Those guys all respect each other, I think, to a certain extent. I mean, it adds to it. I mean, it's like Ford and Chevy. I mean, you gotta have a rivalry to make it exciting.
Well, and here's my only issue with Jeff Gordon and that rivalry that made NASCAR so big is when this split happened. And we started this conversation with the 96, 97, 98, when you started your business and going. That is about when IndyCar got knocked off and NASCAR took over the #1 role in America. That's when I would call it. When that split happened, that was very instrumental into NASCAR becoming the #1 of American motorsports.
It's from the 70s type thing. I was raised basically. I mean, I was born in '74, and I think my first race was in '78. They brought me and my cousins to, my dad, my uncle brought me and my cousins to take up extra seats and all that stuff to get a little more room for those guys because you get squeezed in at the nationals. And
even back then.
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, Knoxville had always been a pretty big deal and all that stuff. I mean, I think it was even bigger than it was now. Last year, actually, that crowd reminded me of like the old
nostalgia.
Yeah, and there was a time before the Outlaws got real big and all that stuff. I mean, that all the big guns would be at Knoxville. You'd have the Swindells come up, Tim Green, Carson, all those guys.
Gary Brazier from Australia, that piece of shit.
Yeah, that stuff. That was the place to race, I mean, everyone's got a nationals now and all that stuff, but I mean, it's like that was the first one, And we knew, we knew way back to Marion and all that stuff when they first started. I mean, we knew Marion Robinson. How we had bought a building from him here in Des Moines, so we knew a lot from Marion, and he told us a lot of stories and stuff, and it was just kind of a historic deal,
Well, and that's just Go ahead.
Yeah, I think your most sports now, we were talking about all the names and all that stuff. That's the problem a lot of places are having now. A lot of racing's having, because, I mean, you got a lot of talent, you got a lot of good equipment and all that stuff. And this in here with Indy, with NASCAR and everything, I mean, you're losing a lot of the big names that you grew up with, or we grew up with.